Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Malak. I'm going to be the chair for the meeting today along with Mauricio. The latest wave of Palestinian resistance um, um, has been awe-inspiring and an incredible sign of strength and solidarity in resisting Israel's illegal occupation, colonization, and ethnic cleansing. An impressively large general strike saw the unification of struggle across Gaza and the West Bank and historic Palestine, bringing together Palestinians all around the world as they have for the past 73 years. The Palestinian people continue to be a beacon of hope and awe in their resistance, courage, and struggle. Internationally, we have seen some of the greatest shows of solidarity for Palestine ever. Millions attended protests all around the world. Here in London, 150,000 people were in London alone. Many trade unionists have taken industrial action, notably dock workers from Livorno, Naples, Durban, and Oakland, who refused to unload Israeli cargo ships, some of which are joining us today. Palestine Action occupied and shut down a factory of Elbit Systems, an Israeli arms manufacturer, and found out that once the fire brigade was called, they stood in solidarity with Palestine and their right to protest. Thousands of students here at King's College London co-signed a letter to demand senior management to divest from companies complicit in sustaining the Israeli apartheid regime, institute an academic boycott, and defend students' right to protest. KCL UCU passed solidarity motions urging members to review any relationships with Israeli institutions and calling the UK government to impose trade sanctions and arms embargoes on Israel. I'll hand it over to Mauricio.
So we see from all of this that the international resistance is at its height and public opinion really stands at a tipping point. This gives us a lot of opportunities to take action. In particularly today, we want to push for a movement to push Kings to disinvest in companies complicit in the occupation. In total, Kings holds over £5 million in companies directly and indirectly supporting and benefiting from Israeli apartheid. Though the SU has passed a motion years ago approving BDS, we have gotten little response from Kings themselves on the topic. We're organizing here both to hear from our wonderful speakers, but also to create a space where we can push for disinvestment of such practices at Kings. It's important that we create an international network and solidarity in order to increase the impact of our pressure. And that's why we're delighted to have speakers from all over the world today. Just a couple of administrative things before we start. We are recording this. We will be recording the first half with our speakers' contributions. The second half, there will be a question and answer session that will not be recorded. Unfortunately, we've had to turn off the chat just to ensure that there's no issues of Zoom bombing, but we'll be able to raise your hands to ask questions in the second portion of the talk. And with all that aside, I'll leave it to Malak to introduce our first speaker. Thank you so much.
Okay. So Raya Sana joins us today from Haifa. She coordinates the Research Center for Who Profits, which looks into the role of the private sector in Israeli occupation economy. You can start, Raya.
Hi everyone. Thank you for everyone at KCL for putting this together, and thank you for asking me to be with you here today. I guess I'm gonna try and give you a little bit of a sense of what has been unfolding in Palestine over the last month and a half, 2 months, kind of lost track of time. I guess in the short 10 minutes that I have, I'll try to give you a sense of what has been happening, because a lot has been happening, and it has been extremely transformative and has been empowering in many ways. And I guess we have to start from the point that what is happening isn't a side note in kind of broader political event. What is happening is transformative. It is transformative on the political level, and it's also transformative on the level of organizing that is taking place. The whole political landscape in Palestine has shifted dramatically over the last month and a half to 2 months. The type of conversations that we're having have transformed, and the type of ways of organizing and looking at ourselves as a people has also been transformed. And I want to maybe address 2 levels of how I see this transformation and how kind of this manifests itself. And the first one is on the political level and the political discourse level. Israeli settler colonialism has for long pursued a strategy of fragmentation that manifests itself not only on the geographical level, so having Palestinians, the mass majority outside of the historic Palestine, but having enclaves in the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and Palestine 48. But this fragmentation, more than just being a geographical fragmentation, what has Israel really tried to do is to implement and entrench social and political fragmentation of us as a Palestinian people. And obviously the intent and the direction is to weaken our social base and political base and our resistance to Israeli settler colonialism. And I think what we have seen over the past few months is a complete negation of this logic, and asserting that this logic has in many ways failed. And to be honest, to a level, we kind of also surprised ourselves. So, because a lot of us were thinking and feeling that we are in the absolute downturn of Palestinian politics. The whole, from Trump, from internally what is taking place in Palestine, be it the Palestinian Authority or be it the political representatives of Palestinian 48ers here, and the kind of the politics that they were pushing and the answers that they were pushing for were continued capitulation to a settler colonial regime. And we had thought that we were weak in many ways. And we were surprised, and that's the beauty of being surprised and and being open to kind of actually moments happening and political transitions happening when you least expect them. And then there's another thing. So this is kind of on the bigger level, that we are moving now in a direction that is much more holistic, that Palestinian people are seeing and feeling the connection. We're talking about, kind of, this has been termed the uprising of unity, of dignity and unity, because it is all the Palestinian people moving together towards one direction, which is ending Israel's settler colonial regime, but also each section of us having our grievances and bringing those to the table, because truth is, our lived experiences are very different. But what Israel's tried to do all the time is to entrench that lived experience of saying you are fundamentally different, therefore your struggle is fundamentally different. And this wasn't just Israel trying to push it, it was also the Palestinian political leadership and the political class that's constantly been pushing this narrative. So what is happening now is both a rejection of kind of a saying that, we're not yet victorious, but at least we have challenged Israel's attempt to completely fragment us. But it's also saying something else. It is also negating and coming in contra and resisting the Palestinian political class that has for so long perpetuated fragmentation, that has for so long actively tried to weaken Palestinian social and political base. And this rejection is not only taking place on the level of like semantics and slogans. So it's not just a question of, oh, we are the Palestinian people, we are in unity with each other and we are struggling with each other. It is actually manifesting itself in ways on the ground, in ways of political organizing and mobilizing. And this rejection of the discourse of the Palestinian political class is also a rejection of the class itself, but is also opened up opportunities for self-organizing and for rediscovering collective agency in ways that we hadn't seen for a really long time, in ways that I don't ever remember in my living, in my life, I don't think it was, it's even more stark and stronger than during the time of the second Intifada, because it wasn't a section of the Palestinian people rising in solidarity with the other, which is often kind of what happens, but it's all of us rising and engulfing the field at the same time. And we saw levels of organizing that wouldn't have been possible if the political class was as dominant as it thought it was. We saw local committees being set up to defend communities from attacks by Israeli citizens that were going around trying to lynch Palestinians wherever they see them and attack Palestinian property. We saw committees of volunteer lawyers coming together and going to police station and representing detainees at the court free of charge. We saw doctors and nurses coming together and developing healthcare committee and health aid committee, because at the time, Israeli ambulances and healthcare workers weren't going into Palestinian communities and weren't giving care and aid for them, that is Palestinian communities in Israel. We saw levels of care and compassion and unity between each other that we hadn't seen before. And it's kind of almost suddenly we were kind of looking at each other being like, oh yeah, we are one people, we are connected. There is a unity between us, and the realization and going back to basics in a way of, yes, we are a colonized people that are fighting for and are struggling for our liberation, and we have to do it together, and we are naturally doing it together despite all the odds. So we witnessed a period that is really ongoing, and I'll kind of maybe come a little bit about how it is ongoing and how it is manifesting. But there was kind of an explosion of a level of self-organizing. It was in every town, in every city, in every village, you had local committees being set up to adhere and to answer local needs, but also to defend and to resist and to put forward conversations and to put forward discussions in terms of political discussions of where we are, what are we doing, where are we going, where are we going. And what was impressive about this level of self-organization, the level of it, that it was really a high level of self-organization, but it was also, a lot of it was new. A lot of it was people coming together spontaneously at that political moment and doing stuff together. So it was kind of a non-centralized, highly organized process that was taking place and continues to take place. And it's really at that moment that the general strike comes. The general strike was a popular demand before it was put forward by any political representative or by any trade union. The call for the general strike came from Palestine 48. It was announced by the High Follow-up Committee for Arab Citizens in Israel, because there was such a high pressure from below calling on the High Commission to act as the only kind of political representative that doesn't engage in the Israeli political landscape. So they don't go to the Israeli Knesset and so on. And they called it, and following that, activists in the West Bank were calling it. Civil society organizations joined the strike. And only after that, the trade unions in the West Bank joined the call for the general strike. And it was the strongest general strike that we have seen for years. The last general strike we had was during Land Day in the 1970s. And so it was a mesmerizing day, it was a mesmerizing moment of that kind of collective unity and collective strength that we have as a Palestinian people, and for strike action re-emerging as a political action and as a strategy that can be part of our resistance and a part of our collective process towards liberation. But what the strike did, it really centralized and really made central the idea of the unity and the idea of us acting as a collective, as a Palestinian people, wherever we were, whether we were in the West Bank or 48 or elsewhere. but it also opened up a lot of conversation that have been dormant in Palestine. They have opened up conversation around class positionality. They have opened up conversation around our economic power. They have opened up conversation about labor rights, and so on. They have opened up conversation about how do we develop some form of independence in the presence, in a reality where we are a colonized population. That opened up conversations about how we build collective agency, about the possibility of building collective agency, because for so long we've been told that we can't do it alone, and we can't do it alone. Of course, the liberation of Palestine hinges on a regional liberation and a regional process and on a global transformation, but we still do have agency, an agency that doesn't only come when we're being bombed, but it's agency that we can, that transforms us and that builds us and that builds social base, that enables us to resist and be active agents in our process and our struggle for liberation. And so now you have, post the general strike, there have been a number of initiatives that have been called and people have been working around. For example, there's a call that was issued for a Palestinian Economic Week, where people focus on supporting Palestinian businesses. But it isn't just about supporting Palestinian initiatives and Palestinian institutions and so on, but it's thinking about who are the Palestinians? Who are we? Like, what is this collective that is the Palestinian people? Are we in unity and in affinity with the Palestinian rural class? Are we in affinity and in unity with Palestinian capitalists that actually benefit from Israeli settler colonialism and work to entrench it all the time? But can we use our power, the minimal power that we have, to start building social bases and solidarity and unity that empower us as a people, and then empower and continue to push us forward in our struggle for liberation? And I guess, you know, who was it? Was it Lenin that said that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen? And this is exactly how we feel. This is exactly what is taking place on the ground at the moment. And I think what is happening in Palestine has defied a lot of our conception of ourselves, but the international community's conception of us, but also it has defied what we were thinking collectively of the state of the solidarity and the possibilities of solidarity on the international level and in the international scale. And so I think it's a moment for all of us to reflect and think hard about what we do to kind of keep this, not in the sense of momentum, but how do we transform this momentum to real processes of decolonization, whether in Palestine or on a global scale. And I'm sorry, I know it took a little bit longer than I should have.
Thank you so much, Raya, sorry. Yeah, so because of like a connection issue, Desmond will have to go next. So Desmond D'Sa is a South African environmentalist and activist who brings us a valuable perspective and experience of life and struggle in apartheid South Africa. So yeah, the floor is yours, Desmond.
So thank you, and apologize that I'm going to be leaving. But I'm always committed to the struggle of the Palestinian people. As Nelson Mandela said, we can never be free in South Africa if the Palestinian people will never be free. So the struggle continues in South Africa, and we are preparing for a long struggle. We don't think that it's going to happen tomorrow. We don't think that we must stop until Palestine is free completely. Working out of Durban with the Palestine Support Group for a number of years now on this struggle regarding how can we put enough pressure on our government. Now, as much as our president and the ANC in government, as well as South African government, have taken a stand that Palestine, that the bombing must stop, that the Palestinian people must be free, but their action speaks otherwise. So they could have sent the Israeli ambassador packing out of South Africa. and we haven't done that. So as civil society and people on the ground, we have built a movement in Durban together with the trade union movement that is working on not offloading any ship that comes out of the Jewish state. And we're targeting the ships similar to what the comrades in Oklahoma did. So that continues, and we know that the ship is arriving on the 11th. So we've had a number of protests in Durban, not as huge and significant like what London has, because we're still in COVID and people are concerned, and the security forces won't allow us to have huge gatherings. We'd love to have the huge gatherings, but I think that's critical. It's people power that will change. So we're developing a strategic plan, not only to stop the shops, but how do we stop them at their shops, stop buying the products as well if it does get through. And then we are going to have a huge action at the harbor on the 11th of July. It's supposed to be the 12th, but we believe that the ship will arrive on the 11th. We have had, about 3 weeks ago, we've had huge programs in Durban around the ship, but also within the city, and invited all the collective groups to be part of it. I was part of it as well, and I'm glad to say that we can put more people on the ground. We can put thousands of people on the ground. Just the concern about the COVID and how does the security force act, given that they won't allow you permission to put those thousands of people on the ground. But we'll see. We'll see what happens, and if they arrest us, so be it. We're going to fight to we will fight very long for this issue, and it's just unfortunate that it's not happening throughout the country. Also, it will be a good sign of everybody united against a common voice. But I think a lot of the religious institutions that we're working with Durban and the civil society from the communities that feel a pain for the Palestine people, we want to say that this message that I'm stating right here, we won't stop. This is what we call during the apartheid era rolling mass action. And those that will know during the apartheid, what brought it back, what brought it down was constant in the face of the enemy, constantly fighting and reminding that we're not going away, constantly keeping them informed that we are yet to fight a battle to free Palestine completely and not partially, to free the Palestine people completely as a whole, and not free some and allow it to carry on and then think that the Jewish state has done us a favor. I think like we have learned in South Africa, if you free the people and free the mind, you free them completely. That's what Steve Biko said. So we want to ensure that in our lifetime, that the people in Palestine is free. So that's why we embarked on that campaign. We haven't embarked on there for the sake of embarking on it. We've embarked on it because we understand that without the Palestinian people being free, we in South Africa can never claim freedom. So that's why we understand the dynamics and how many people helped us during the struggle during the anti-apartheid struggle and the fights we've had. That it took a huge effort from people, not only in South Africa, but all over the world, that came together and declared apartheid a crime against humanity. And likewise with this year, a crime against humanity against the Palestinian people. That's what the apartheid, the pariah state of Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. So we want to support fully the freedom of the Palestinian people and ensure that our programs reach the Palestinian people and give them hope that they're not alone anymore. And that the people all over the world and in South Africa and in Durban, we will fight. And we will put our bodies on the line to ensure that the government listens. So that's the idea around what we started to do again. And it's a pity that we have to start and stop. I don't think we want to stop. I think this program that has been, this campaign against the pariah state must be ongoing, must be something that lives in every one of us. Not only once a while, not only daily, it must be every minute of the day. So the message gets across that people are really going to fight this battle all over. Similar to a plan that we developed during the anti-apartheid struggle, where we got people from all over the world to come in and to challenge them. So on the sports field, there should be a boycott of sports against Israel, completely. On the economic field, there should be a boycott of the products that are made on Palestinian land, stolen land. And that should apply right across. You know, no sector should be left out of it. So that's the plan. That's what we want to put forward, that we need to communicate better. We need to understand from the Palestinians what are the products, much more. We now getting to know the ships and all that, so we need to put pressure on the union to say, look at, jobs are important, but so do Palestinian lives are important. And you can't just do it as a once-off. They must know they can never enter the ports in South Africa. And the unions have got the power to do that. So we're talking to the working class. We're saying we want to be part of everything. We need to know how we can collectively put a huge fight together that can bring this issue of Palestine once and for all over and done with. And that the Jewish state must know they're no longer going to be doing what they want to do. They will know that our fight in Durban in South Africa is going to be the same fight and the same effort that we put against the apartheid government that brought about change. So I want to just say this here, that we have been meeting on a regular basis. We have meetings with all the support groups to bring together this collective struggle to our government, but also to the shipping of the Jewish state, that they won't be offloaded in our ports and their products won't be sold. So we are going to take on some of the big major shopping of major food chains and deal with them as well. Because if their products are being allowed to sell in South Africa, then we must tell our public not to buy them. And we must take them and throw them out of our shops. So we can't just have one.
Desmond, would you please come to
your
your closing remarks, if that's all right? We're just trying to make sure there's time for everyone to speak. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So finally, I just want to say that our action is planned for the 11th, but we have regular actions every week on our roads and in our shops to highlight the issue of the Palestinian fights and to say that enough is enough, and we stand with the Palestinian people wholeheartedly, with all our might. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Leanne. Leanne is a British Palestinian human rights activist. She's a public speaker and a member of King's Student Justice for Palestine. Just as a PSA, just to make sure that we all stay on time, we'll be making a little knocking noise once your time is up, and we ask that you come to your closing remarks once you hear that. I'll also be messaging you just to remind you. Leanne, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you to everyone tuning in to this very important discussion today. It's truly an honour to be speaking alongside such legends, and honestly so much respect to you all. My name is Leanne Mohammed, and I am the current and ongoing president of the KCL Students for Justice for Palestine Society, and I am also a British Palestinian student at KCL. Now, as a student in one of the most complicit universities, I feel a duty and a responsibility to take action to change that. And I believe that all students should feel the same. I'm certainly not proud of my university, and I'm angry that they are complicit through nearly £4 million of unethical investments in companies complicit with Israeli apartheid. And in fact, it is shameful that KCL, alongside 113 other UK universities, invest in companies that are involved in Israel's human rights abuses against the Palestinian people. Now, Israel's system of institutionalized racist discrimination amounting to the crime of apartheid can only be sustained through these weapons, technology, and other support that it receives from companies around the world. But our UK universities are deeply complicit, investing altogether over 400 million in companies that sustain Israel's illegal economy and arms trade, companies that are complicit in Israel's continuous violations of international law. This is why I am a student activist involved in these divestment campaigns, because I simply do not stand for the normalization of apartheid, occupation, colonialism, human rights abuses, and violations of international human rights law. Our education can no longer be at the expense of human rights. And as students, we have the power not only to challenge this, but to change this. Apartheid has no place in our institutions, in our communities, in our societies, and in our world. And we need to be part of the change to say no to apartheid everywhere. Now, kings are directly aiding the oppression of the Palestinian people, and we cannot normalize this. These are my people, and I cannot express how demeaning it feels to have my own university fund this oppression. This is why we need to take action to end this disgraceful complicity. We are now at a stage where the BDS movement is growing internationally like never before, and we mustn't stop in the middle of the road. The case for BDS has never been more urgent, and the freeing of Palestine requires divestment from all of us, from our homes to our institutions. We are calling for global solidarity with our Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality through BDS. And I think so many people underestimate the power that BDS can actually have if we all play our part. So it's time to actually listen to Palestinians, to commit to BDS, and to advocate for our Palestinian liberation. Israel will never hold itself accountable for its own crimes. This is why we need to hold them accountable, along with the corporations and institutions that enable them and shamelessly support them. Now, often students tend to take a step back from our Palestine solidarity movement because they feel that they do not have enough political knowledge on the situation. Or often you hear the comment, oh, it's too complicated, it's too controversial. And then you get, the comments about, I'd rather just be neutral and not get involved, which I think are ridiculous. Apart from these comments being so dehumanizing for a Palestinian, which is a whole other conversation in itself that I can go on about, it's also shocking and quite ignorant if you ask me, because the simple truth and reality is that there is nothing, absolutely nothing complicated about anything that is going on. It is simple, black and white. It's about those on one side who believe in the equality of all and those on the other who believe in the supremacy of some. The oppressed and the oppressors, the colonizer and the colonizer, displacing and the displaced. And as Desmond D'Sa famously said, who actually, by the way, is KCL alumni from our Department of Theology, he said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. What we are dealing with here is not an ethnic or a religious struggle, but an anti-racist, anti-colonialist, humanitarian struggle. That is the struggle that every student can and must support, that every human can and must support. Because Palestinian rights are human rights. And when you stand for justice for Palestine, you are standing against apartheid, against oppression, against discrimination, against anti-Semitism, and against racism in all its forms. We must continue boycotting, protesting, and educating, and unapologetically continue to speak out and take action until they have justice. Our generation truly has the power to dismantle this system of oppression. We must never be intimidated nor afraid, and in fact, it must be a duty upon all of us to call out these atrocities and human rights violations, no matter the cost or the consequences. As Israel continues its violations and its violent regime of ethnic cleansing and apartheid, it is now more vital than ever that we continue to stand together and organize for Palestine. Remember, our solidarity movement is not a trend. It is a continuous fight until justice prevails. Our work doesn't stop here. We must insist to continue our path of resistance, supporting the oppressed and never the oppressors. And if you're watching this and you want to do something, you want to help and you want to be a part of this bigger change, it's never too late to start now, because whatever we take up and start today will impact change for tomorrow. So keep posting on social media, keep Palestine viral, keep amplifying Palestinian voices, keep boycotting Israeli products, target the companies that are complicit in these human rights violations, call on your representatives to speak up and act now, continue lobbying, support divestment campaigns across all UK campuses, join your Palestine Society if you are at university. If there ain't one, create one, organise, keep pushing, just keep the conversation going. Now, on the upcoming 16th anniversary of the Palestinian call for BDS, PSD have organised a student protest on the 9th of July, where we will march through London universities to demand an end to our institution's complicity in Israeli apartheid. So please save the date and I'll see you guys there. For the rest of you, I'll see you all at this Saturday's protest at 1 p.m. Downing Street if you're in London, to call on sanctions on Israel. The numbers so far have been amazing. The tide is truly turning. The fight for justice is now, and we need every single one of you to join us, because as long as the colonization continues, so will our student activism and our global resistance. I'm just going to finish off with the words of Muhammad al-Kurd from Sheikh Jarrah. They are betting on our exhaustion. I am betting on our stubbornness. Don't tire, don't bore. Don't stop talking about Palestine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Leon. Next, we have Hisham Safieddin, who will speak as a member of KCL University College Union, and talk about what they've done in regards to BDS and Palestinian solidarity. The floor is yours, Hisham.
Sorry, just unmuting. That was a hard act to follow, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's a pleasure to hear everybody speak before me, and I'm sure obviously also after me. And thank you, Mauricio and Malak, and everybody else who's organized this, and particularly for our student body from whom we are learning, as well as staff. So good morning, everybody. I am speaking today as a member, not official representative of KCL UCU. I have been active alongside wonderful fellow members, some of whom are actually present with us, in building support for union solidarity with the Palestinian people, including Palestinian educators, students, and the labor movement. I'm also a lecturer on the modern Middle East, and I teach the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So it's not an advert, but if you're interested, I hopefully will be teaching it next term. And my comments today are based and inspired by the commendable work of KCL UCU members and others as well. As we gather today, the deadly assault against Palestinians in Jerusalem and Gaza and the rest of historic Palestine has not ended, even if large-scale military operations have for now ceased and the media attention has shifted elsewhere. We know that the suffocating siege of Gaza is still in place. We know that the dispossession of Palestinians is still kept apace from the river to the sea. Israel has systematically attacked and undermined education in Palestine for decades. This includes the bombing or destruction of schools, as well as the arrest, torture, and kidnapping of students and lecturers, and the raiding of campuses. This last war was not an exception. Bookstores and libraries were not spared. The ceasefire, by the way, itself, as we have seen, was followed by a large-scale crackdown on Palestinians inside the 1948 borders. These mass arrests of Palestinians, many of them youth, who simply dared to protest decades of discrimination, these youths, their citizenship, their Israeli citizenship, did not help protect them. And we still hear about those who claim that Hamas is the problem. The most recent episode of Israeli onslaught and Palestinian resistance has revealed, as others have said, the urgency of international and sustained solidarity with the Palestinian people. We have seen more than 3 decades of so-called peace agreements, but even up until now, major human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch have confirmed what Palestinians, as well as KCL alumnus, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and other anti-racist activists have said all along, namely that Israel is an apartheid state. The call for BDS has also been there for a long time, initiated by Palestinian civil society and the labor movement. And this includes the boycott of institutions, Israeli institutions such as universities, in addition to divestment. There is, of course, momentum that's growing for solidarity. We have heard about the UK petition to Parliament, calling on sanctions to be imposed on Israel. It's got over 380,000 signatures. We've got the wonderful letter by our students, which I believe is unprecedented. We also have several trade unions and labor activists in Britain, South Africa, and Italy that have taken concrete steps to enforce the boycott. And in this regard, I want to salute all these workers in Naples, Durban, Oklahoma, Leicester for the brave stand. And in my view, they have set an example to us all academics of what it means to practice what we preach, and to step out of our ivory towers and put our intellectual labor in the service of our communities and in the pursuit of justice. There are, to be fair, good tidings in academia as well, even if it's still shy of all-out action. And we have seen hundreds of endorsements on collective statements from university departments, from programs, from faculty unions, from research centers, and from academic associations. And there have been thousands of individual pledges as well. Despite this outpour of support and despite several successes, we are still a long way from turning it into an all-out victory. This is no cause for pessimism, of course. It is actually a call to double our efforts. And in my view, as far as solidarity with Palestine in the UK is concerned, I think we have two major challenges that come to mind. The first is winning the battle of public opinion. And in my opinion, that means that the fact of apartheid becomes unequivocally acknowledged. This requires putting an end to the unacceptable demonization of human rights activism supporting Palestine by labeling it as anti-Semitic. In academia, this means revoking the IHRA definition. The definition is not controversial. It is immoral and unethical. It is the abuse and instrumentalization of one good cause, fighting anti-Semitism, to undermine another good cause, fighting Israeli racism. It literally requires us teachers, among other unethical things, to deny a well-documented case of ethnic cleansing, or else label us anti-Semitic. So either you deny the historic ethnic cleansing or you're anti-Semitic. Shame on them, not on us. There are many ways to push past against these anti-democratic campaigns, but I would say that acting in a low-key manner, no pun intended low-key, you're anything but, or being on the defensive is not one of them. And if the last few years are an indication, trying to appease this campaign has only emboldened it. An attack on one of us must be treated an attack on all of us. We have nothing to hide. Our struggle is a struggle of equality for all, a struggle against all forms of discrimination. This is a progressive cause. And were it not for the systematic dehumanization of Palestinians, it would be a no-brainer. But it's precisely because they have lost the argument that they are resorting to a top-down approach to shut down debate. And they are not hesitant to use their last fig leaf, at the risk, I would add, of undermining the commendable fight against anti-Semitism. This is why we must retake the initiative in setting the terms of the debate. In Europe, let's be clear, the threat is the far right, incidentally, many of whom are allies of Israel. Fighting anti-Semitism should be part and parcel of the struggle against all forms of racism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, queerphobia, and all forms of racism, including anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism. It must never be misused to draw a wedge between all of these struggles. That's what we have to be careful about. And let us be equally crystal clear. In the case of Palestine, the primary form of racism is Jewish supremacy, not anti-Semitism. To those who wish to portray it otherwise, I say, do not, in a typical Orientalist manner, transport your prejudices and debates in Europe somewhere else, especially when you are doing so for the disgraceful purpose of denying another people their very basic right. And so we must not get lost in the alleyways of this debate at the expense of the Palestinian cause. And in my view, one of the best ways to do so is to focus on actual acts of solidarity that directly or indirectly defy these silencing attempts. And this brings me to the second challenge, which is how to turn verbal solidarity into real action. I won't go too much in the interest of time. There is clear support, for example, among UCU and other unions for BDS. But we have to be honest, with the benefit of hindsight, BDS, there's a lot of endorsement, but little action. A major obstacle is the threat of lawfare. We must educate ourselves on the risks involved, but we should not turn lawfare into debilitations. Not a single gain for equality was initially sanctioned by the law. Let's remember that. It's the other way around. It is people's struggles that have changed the law. The key, in my view, is A, to have students and staff work together in unity. The second is for different union branches to coordinate closely so none of us is singled out. And the third is to build an institutional memory. So we don't go in circles, we don't spend a lot of energy on things that have been done prior. So we're able to actually calculate and measure our success and our failure. There's a lot to do. KCL is high on the list of complicity, as has been told, but this means we also have opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. So let us remain united and resolved In this and all other struggles for liberation and freedom, let us stand tall and proud for Palestine. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for your contribution. Next up, we have Joanna. Joanna is an Ashkenazi British anti-Zionist Jew living in East London. She's a founding member of Jewish Solidarity Action, formerly known as Jews Against Boris, and an active member of the Jewish collective Judas. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. It's so wonderful to be here with my fellow panelists on this event. I wanted to actually spend my time here talking about colonialism as it relates to Israel-Palestine, but also specifically to how it relates to the Jewish and Muslim populations in the UK. I do see Israel as a colonial state. I think its leaders saw it as emancipatory only really for European Jews. It used very colonialist frameworks to establish itself. It's backed up now by neocolonialism. And to me, the Palestinian experience is one of a colonized people. And I think quite obviously there's already a link from the very beginning between the British state and Zionism, as Britain controlled mandatory Palestine as part of the British Empire. And it was, you know, really the British, like the Balfour Declaration, that allowed for this creation of a Jewish state, of the State of Israel. Some historical context I kind of want to give to this time of kind of early Zionism, sort of particularly the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and what's happening in Britain and the British Jewish community is you've got quite an established British Jewish community that have mostly come from sort of Spain and Portugal and done very well despite legal restrictions. They're basically enjoying a lot of freedom, and they suddenly become really anxious because lots of Eastern European Jews are coming over who are like uneducated, poor, religious, like they only speak Yiddish, and they're suddenly like, oh God, like we're going to lose all of our privileges because the state is going to see these Jews, and like there's going to be an uptick in anti-Semitism. I think this leads to like quite a colonial dynamic where you have things like the Board of Deputies being set up, where I think Britain is very happy with this. It's like they're kind of, you know, standard go-to of how to control communities, right? As you have community representatives who are typically, you know, the elites that you can go to who will like control that section of the population. And it's obviously like the, you know, a lot of like the Jewish ruling class is pretty happy with this in terms of being able to keep a lot of the privileges they've amassed. And when you look, so Theodor Herzl, who's seen as the father of Zionism, he actually sells Zionism to Britain as a solution to stop Russian Jewish immigration. Politicians like Arthur Balfour, Lord Salisbury, who are like very preeminent British non-Jewish Zionists, they very much support curbing Jewish immigration into Britain, as they are at the same time as supporting Zionism. So I think already from the beginning here, we're seeing like this certain dynamic around like Zionism, the British colonial state, and the Jewish population itself. The other like historical point I want to make is that British Jews on the whole are not like initially super Zionist. The Board of Deputies itself does not support Zionism until like 1940 to 1943. And it's not really until the Six-Day War in 1967 that like actually British Jews start supporting Zionism in large numbers. And then we particularly start to see in the 90s, this is like what I really want to talk about, this this theory of like the new anti-Semitism, this idea that like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and this becomes super bound up in Islamophobia. And the way I really see this like relating to colonialism is I think in colonialism and colonial logics, we really have this like, you know, setup of like barbarians versus the civilized. And this dynamic essentially gets put onto British Muslims and British Jews. So Israel is seen as the symbol for like, you know, the West's outpost in the Middle East, the nice like civilized West versus the barbaric Arab states. And British Jews are seen as like a symbol of Israel in the UK. And this particularly allows politicians to basically use supporting Israel or supporting the Jewish community or fighting anti-Semitism as an excuse for like Islamophobic attitudes. We see this, I think, particularly like from Blair up until Johnson at the moment. But I want to like actually just read this quote from an interview with David Cameron, because I think it just encapsulates so much of this dynamic. It says, but David Cameron says, "The Jewish community in Britain makes an incredibly important contribution to our country. It is so well integrated into every part of life. What is frightening at the moment because of the rise in Islamist extremism is you see a new threat to the new anti-Semitism and not traditional anti-Semitism. We have to be very clear about threat. This is a dangerous line that people keep crossing over that says anti-Zionism is a legitimate form of political discourse. I feel like there's so much just like in these like 3 sentences from David Cameron. You know, he starts off talking about British Jews as these amazing, like assimilated, well-integrated groups, unlike these, you know, Islamist extremists, the bad Muslims who haven't managed to, you know, integrate into British society, and then ties it all up by, you know, saying that like, because of this, we can't support anti-Zionism, that is like beyond the political pale. And I think we see like this dynamic continuing with the way that, you know, prevent is used in schools to stop school kids supporting Palestine, the way that like at universities, like I know for me as a student trying to organize, we had to jump through so many hoops around trying to organize events on Palestine, which particularly as a Jewish student is weird and frustrating to come up against like questions of anti-Semitism. So yeah, there's very much, I think, a continuation of this kind of logic from the British state that is really like using the Jewish community as political football whilst actually not being invested in the Jewish community, I would say, ever. And I do want to say that, like, yes, you know, anti-Semitism, like, is real, does really exist in the Palestinian movement at times. That is something like I've come up against. At the same time, I think, you know, we've got to be careful of like not getting distracted by it. Like, I don't expect or demand that any Palestinian has to talk about anti-Semitism to talk about the oppression they face. Like, I don't think that is at all a reasonable demand, and it's a distraction. But yeah, it is upsetting to me as a Jew to see anti-Semitism like pop up. I'm also heartened by the fact that I think those who are like, you know, against anti-Semitism and willing to challenge it far outnumber those who are perpetuating it in those spaces. But what I like wanted to sum up by saying is that my freedom as a Jew can only come from the dismantling of colonialism. That, like, for me, trying to tie my freedom as a Jew to the colonial project of Israel, and I think I see this from like the British history of, you know, supporting Israel while supporting curbs on Jewish immigration. You know, these people would not have wanted my ancestors to come to this country. That is always going to be a false freedom. Like, that's never going to be real freedom. That if I want to get free as a Jew, as an ethnic minority, I need to stand against colonialism and everything that that represents. And that is why, like, I'm supporting the Palestinian struggle, why I'm so glad to be here with my fellow panelists fighting against colonialism. And I'm really just heartened to see how much the Palestinian struggle is being talked about and is being furthered at the moment. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Next, we have Lara Kiswani, who joins us representing Arab Resource and Organizing Center, San Francisco, the group that blocked the shipping line from a port in Oakland. The floor is yours, Lara.
Thanks so much for having me. So hello from Oakland, California. I'm really honored to be alongside so many of you, especially given the content of today's conversation. Often Palestinians and others were asked to speak about our oppression and what's happening on the ground and the conditions. Very rarely do we get to speak about victories, and very rarely do people actually ask us to connect the dots around our legacy, our collective legacy of resistance. So I very much appreciate the framework today. I'm going to just share the story of Block the Boat here in Oakland, because we believe it's an international victory for everyone, and we are looking forward to the potential of future work to continue to isolate apartheid Israel economically, politically, and culturally. In 2014, during the war on Gaza, people across the world were rising up in solidarity and mobilizing. And similarly, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we did the same. We mobilized in the thousands in the streets of San Francisco, and we continue to think about creative strategies to actually disrupt Israeli apartheid. We wanted to take on direct action strategies around boycott, divest, and sanctions. And one of the ideas that came up was blocking the boat. So at the Port of Oakland, one of the largest ports in the United States, every weekend, the largest shipping company, that being from Israel, that being the Zim shipping line, would come dock at the port of Oakland. ILW Local 10, the Longshore Warehouse Union locally, has a long history of militant resistance and internationalism, standing in solidarity with our comrades during apartheid South Africa, as well as against police violence and war and militarism in the early 2000s. So we got a call from the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza, calling on worker solidarity across the world, but specifically labor here in the United States. And we wanted our local longshoremen to heed that call. So we engaged with them, we shared that statement with them, we spoke with the union, and we were able to successfully mobilize thousands of people to the port of Oakland for 1 day, for 5 days, and for 5 consecutive days. The workers did not unload that ship. And again, it came back the next month and the workers did not unload that ship. And again, we mobilized the following month and the workers did not unload that ship. One thing to note is ILW Local 10 is a predominantly Black-led, Black-based union. So the solidarity that was built during 2014 set the tone for what cross-movement building, labor worker organizing can look like here in the United States, and built on legacies of resistance between our communities, not just here in the US, but globally. Most recently, we found out during this recent assault on Palestinian people in Palestine, throughout Palestine, that the Israeli Zim ship was attempting to dock again. So what's important to note is that since 2014, the Zim shipping line stopped coming to Oakland. So we successfully interrupted international commerce from the state of Israel. And in 2021, during this recent assault, for some reason or another, the Israeli shipping line thought this was their time to try again. And we proved them wrong. So as soon as we got the word that the Israeli shipping line was attempting to come back to the port of Oakland, we put out a call to action. We also got another statement from the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions asking again for workers across the world, but specifically workers in the United States, to honor community pickets, to not unload Israeli cargo, and to continue to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. I asked to speak at the Union Hall to address the members and the leadership, to share this statement with them, and to also honor the sacrifice of ILW historically, as they did not work that ship in 2014, and to let them know about our actions in the coming days. As soon as we put the call to action out, the ship did not dock. It continued to stay at bay. It was meant to dock around the 3rd week of May. It did not actually dock until last Friday. That being in large part due to the fact that we had already 5,000 people subscribed to our text alert system, ready to mobilize at any given moment. We learned from 2014 that our adversaries will have maneuvers to try to disorganize or even wear us out. They were unsuccessful in doing so. As the ship remained at bay, it tried to go to a different port in Southern California. It then returned back to Oakland, remained at bay, and then we called for an international week of action. We asked for people across the world to also boycott Zim, for workers across the world and other port cities to organize community pickets in solidarity with Oakland. We understood that if we are able to once again turn the ship away from Oakland, that we are actually maintaining and sustaining an international victory for not only for Palestine, but for all workers, anti-racist and anti-imperialists around the world. And last Friday, we were able to get over 100 endorsers, including our comrades in South Africa from the Federation of Trade Unions, CASATU and others, and BDS South Africa and BNC in Palestine. And within a couple hours, we mobilized thousands to the port of Oakland. We showed up, we had 6 consecutive pickets. The workers did not cross our pickets. We showed up again for the second shift, 6 consecutive pickets. The workers did not cross our pickets. And we had one of the most dramatic events in our time we're blocking the boat, where we actually watched the ship leave. So we successfully stopped Israeli commerce. We successfully interrupted international commerce. And in essence, we successfully interrupted global capitalism as a win for Palestine, but really as a win for all people fighting for dignity and liberation. Here in the United States, we understand our role in a very particular way, in that when we are challenging apartheid Israel, we're also challenging US imperialism. We understand Israel as a partner and instrument to US imperialism. We understand Israel as instrumental to global militarism and policing. And we know that when we're able to isolate Israel, apartheid Israel in that way, we too are contributing to the fight against US imperialism. We are exposing that relationship, and we are demonstrating the economic and political power of the grassroots, what we're able to do and accomplish when we fight together. So as you all are students and activists across in London, I would also just say that there's so much potential and hope when we think about building across movements, across sectors, but also having a class analysis and building with workers in order to actually succeed and build momentum and continue to challenge apartheid Israel, because this is a particular moment. The consensus across social justice movements is that Palestine is a social justice issue. And we have an opportunity now to continue to build on these victories. So as I speak, we are continuing to build on an international campaign against the Zim shipping line. We are going to have pickets and boycotts across the world. And we've had actions already across the world in solidarity. So thank you for allowing me to share this lesson with you all, this victory, and thanks for also building on that collectively.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Loki. Loki needs no introduction. He's a rapper and activist who we're very happy to have here speak with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, as has been laid out before us, the Palestinian people are aching to be free from imperialism, colonialism, and its sequels. They have been articulating their unfreedom for some time, and it is our job in the rest of the world to not only interpret those yearnings for justice, but also coordinate directly with them. The Palestinian resistance against Zionism represents a universal struggle for justice, the longest continuous anti-colonial struggle in the world from the 1880s to today. They have applied the fabulous quote by Eduardo Galeano when he said, it's worthwhile to die for things without which it is not worthwhile to live. Britain's role in what has happened in Palestine, in the Zionist colonization of Palestine, is well documented, from the training of both Vladimir Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion in the British Army in World War I, to the application of the Balfour Declaration by Britain's first High Commissioner, laying the foundation for the apartheid reality of today by establishing separate institutions for the indigenous Palestinians and for the settler community, to the establishing of the Haganah from the Zionist gangs in 1936, British General Ord Wingate and others helped to bring these people together and form them into a weapon to squash what was the longest strike in recorded human history that the Palestinians led in 1936. You also saw the British develop the demolishing of buildings for punitive reasons in Palestine. Over 2,000 from 1936 to 1940 were destroyed by the British. You also saw the use of Palestinians as minesweepers, essentially using them as human shields. Of course, these are tactics Israel uses in the contemporary context that Britain established throughout this period. The Nakba of 1967, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, could not have taken place without 500 Centurion tanks that the Labour government of Harold Wilson in this country sold to Israel just before it. And today we exist at a time where Elbit Systems, the biggest Israeli arms company, has 6 companies here and 4 subsidiaries within this country. We have seen the heroic campaign against the main factories of Elbit Systems within this country. We also know that there are over 100 companies here who have offices and factories in this country and sell military equipment to the state of Israel. We know that the F-16 and the F-35 that Israel claims to have used in this latest campaign on Gaza both contain components made by the biggest British arms company, BAE Systems. So when Benjamin Netanyahu poses in front of the F-16 jets and threatens to make an example of Gaza, you know that Britain is involved through making the HUD technology for target selection in the F-16. We must bring that to an end. We think about the life for people in Gaza. What is the status quo? It's a population that generally grows by about 5,000 people every month. That adds up to about 60,000 people per year. In 20 years' time, you will be talking about 5 million people in Gaza, the largest open-air prison that for 14 years has been subject to a blockade, which is a form of collective punishment recognized as a war crime to a civilian population, recognized as a war crime according to Geneva Conventions. You're talking about 3 to 4 hours of electricity per day, 2 to 3 hours of running water every few days. 97% of the water in Gaza unfit for domestic use. But what we have constantly seen, and it's important that we assert very clearly, Israel and its stenographers around the world seek to turn what is a unified struggle and a refusal of imposed fragmentation as just about one organization in Gaza. But let's be absolutely clear. The United States government ostensibly represents 331 million people. The UK ostensibly represents 66 million people. Israel supposedly represents 9 million people. And the EU supposedly represents 446 million people. Those institutions and governments recognize Palestinian resistance as terrorism. So altogether, that adds up to about 861 million people, supposedly being represented by these governments. But what about the rest of the world? The government of Switzerland represents 8.5 million people. Pakistan represents 223 million people. Turkey represents 82 million people. The government of China represents 1.4 billion people. Russia represents 144 million people. Iran represents 82 million people. And Venezuela represents 28 million people. I could go on and on and on. Far more people in the world are represented by governments who do not define Palestinian resistance as terrorism. And moreover, UN Resolution 3246 asserts specifically that Palestinians have the right to liberate themselves from foreign occupation through armed struggle. What was revealed in this period was Israel's inherent fragility. It cannot economically withstand the type of prolonged military conflict that it may have sought to pursue. You have to remember that the Israeli army is a reserve army. So you are taking people out of the existing economy of the country and placing them into the warfare situation. You have almost 2 million citizens of the Israeli state are Palestinian. Let's not forget that originally they, after 1948, remained in their homes, and only a third of them were given citizenship to the state. If they met the conditions of the nationality law in 1952, ways they could get it, many of them did not get it until that nationality law was amended in 1980. This is a population that suffers from a plurality of alienations, and the very same land logic that is applied to Palestinians in the West Bank has been applied to Palestinians within the state of Israel. By 1981, Palestinians within the Israeli state had lost 70% of their land in areas apart from the Naqab. So we are talking about a war also against Palestinian jobs within the agriculture sector, moving them into the service sector. So today, a situation where 2/3 of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship work within the service sector in Jewish localities. What we're also talking about is a situation where Jewish people are paid 35% more generally than Palestinians, who have Israeli citizenship. 50% of Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship live below the poverty line. And even according to figures from a few decades ago, you had infant mortality rates double for Palestinian citizens of Israel as they were for Jewish citizens of Israel. In this recent phase, you saw 65,000 Palestinian workers who work in the construction sector in Israel. 99.9% of them refused to come to work for 1 day. According to the Israel Builders Association, that cost the Israeli economy $40 million. You look at the transportation ministry, 910 drivers, 10% of all bus drivers in the state of Israel did not come on the day of the strike. And that led to 300 separate journeys having to be cancelled. Almost 50% of pharmacists within the state of Israel are Palestinian citizens of Israel. What was demonstrated by the unified effort of the resistance in Gaza and Palestinians within the state of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, and Palestinians in diaspora with others around the world is that key economic columns of racist Israeli apartheid can be disabled. You even saw in countries like the UAE and Saudi, the #1 Twitter trend, Palestine Qadiyati. This was something, Palestine is my cause. That was the #1 Twitter trend in these two countries, where there has been an effort to alienate those populations from the Palestinian people. Now, how will they contain this? So we already know that Joe Biden gives to Israel $10.4 million per day, $430,000 per hour, $7,229 per minute, and $120 per second to racist Israeli apartheid. But the Israelis are due to make the request for $1 billion more in emergency aid from the United States. This is the biggest piece of evidence that Israel suffered major defeats in this last war. You can ask yourself, what is the United States offering to rebuild Gaza after hundreds of civilian buildings and governmental buildings were destroyed? $5.5 million. That probably wouldn't be enough to repair one or two of those buildings. Israel attempted to crush the social media side of this with real censorship. But there is an extension of that. Remember, the Palestinian Prisoner Study Center found from 2015 to 2018, over 500 Palestinians, among them children, were arrested for incitement on social media, according to the state of Israel. The vast majority of those cases came from Facebook. But let's look critically at these organizations. Whitney Webb's investigation found that in Google in 2019, there were 28 former employees of Unit 8200, the military intelligence of the IDF, working within Google. She also found that there were at least 13 Unit 8200 alumni working in the company Facebook. Is this not a conflict of interest? Does this have a relation to the level of censorship that we have seen? We also know that ADL, the well-known Israel lobby group, has been appointed as a trusted flagger organization for YouTube. Is that the reason that we have seen serious censorship on platforms like YouTube? Now, the relationship between the state of Israel and fascism is also well established, whether it's Vladimir Jabotinsky admiring Mussolini or the wooing of Latin American fascist dictators. Israel has an established role in seeing fascism as akin to it. But when Tommy Robinson turned up to a pro-Israeli demonstration here alongside the Israeli ambassador, many scratched their head and just wouldn't understand why. Well, if you look clearly at the organizations that fund, yeah.
You could please.
Okay, so you want me to wrap up?
Remarks. Yeah,
no problem,
so
no problem. Last central point that has to be made. You've had hundreds of children in this country who are getting called racist within the school system merely for stating their solidarity with the Palestinian people. The British government is attempting to bring in organizations like Solutions Not Sides, the Community Security Trust, and the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine to deal with young people stating their solidarity with Palestinians. Solutions Not Sides is has a parent organization called One Voice. One Voice, its board is full of major pro-Israeli actors, including Major General Danny Rothschild, who was the former Israeli military governor of the West Bank, who had to abscond from the UK in 2011 because he was likely to face charges. He could have faced charges for alleged war crimes. The Community Security Trust is known. Anthony Lerman, the founder of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, made clear that Community Security Trust volunteers not only are directly trained by Israel's external intelligence service, but also coordinate with it. And the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine is financed by the Home Office's Building a Stronger Britain Together Fund. That is part of the counter-extremism initiative. We have to be clear about what's happening to the young people in schools. The last point, just before I finish, is this. You have weapons being built in this country by members of unions who voted for BDS 10 years ago, right? We need to put pressure on unions like Unite to implement that motion that was passed by their members to apply BDS across all of their members. We need the NEU, the National Education Union, to stand clearly with children in schools and not to leave them out to dry. Yes, we put pressure on the universities to get the money out of those companies. Yes, we put money and we put pressure on the financial institutions that have 10.8 billion pounds worth of investments in arms companies and other companies complicit in Zionist colonization of Palestine. We know that we are on the right side of history. In the period coming of lawfare, we have to be absolutely crystal clear about where we stand.
Thank you so much. This is great. Okay, so next we have Anne Alexander, who is the co-editor of the magazine MENA Solidarity Network and is also joining us from the Cambridge UCU. She will speak about attempts to build a unified position on BDS and UCU. But before I give the floor to Anne, I want to say, if you have a question, please raise your hand and now, and we'll take note of order and call on you during the Q&A session. Alternatively, you can send your questions to me or Mauricio and we'll address them. Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers for putting together an amazing meeting. And it is a real privilege to be virtually on the same panel as comrades from so many different places, obviously from Palestine itself, with Rhea's contribution, but also from South Africa, from the US, and I think we're going to hear from comrades from Italy as well. And that really, I think, shows the global scale of the solidarity movement for Palestine at the moment. What I want to talk about, because others have spoken extremely well about that, is more about how that should impact us as activists within UCU, the union, and as academics, as researchers, and people working in universities, and how we can work alongside and in solidarity with student campaigns such as this, student-led campaigns such as this one. I want to briefly go back though to what we heard at the beginning, which was about the scale of the general strike in Palestine a few weeks ago. And I would say that, you know, this is actually the key thing that we must, you know, we need to learn as activists here, that real change comes from below, and that it's not governments and generals that bring that about, but ordinary people, and that we do have power based on what we do. That, as Loki just said, you know, that the Palestinian pharmacists inside Israel and the bus drivers have power in relation to the work that they do that is essential in Israeli society, and that universities are actually things that will not function without us, that we are the university, not our senior management, and certainly not Gavin Williamson or the Minister for Higher Education, Michelle Donnellan. What I want to focus on really is some of the things that Hisham talked about in terms of how do we turn this wave of solidarity into something more concrete. And I would argue that we actually need to see organisation on a mass scale inside universities. We need to build on the beginnings that we've seen in the last few weeks of incredibly important initiatives that have brought together Again, as Hisham noted, hundreds and thousands of academics across the world, and other people working in universities. Very large numbers of university departments and research centres, members of branches and of academic unions like UCU, and that what that organisation needs to help build is a confidence to resist and refuse, to say no to being complicit in injustice and in oppression, but also to saying yes inside our institutions to a space for Palestinian voices to be heard, to say yes to debate and discussion, and to the voices from below that are excluded from the historical narrative otherwise, to say yes to discussing and learning about the history of ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism in Palestine. And I think one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that building organisation at scale is really important here, because the declarations that we make have to be backed up by organised social movements. That's what gives people confidence as individuals to join collective action. It's the same in a strike, that as every single person who goes on strike faces an individual decision whether to join the picket line or whether to cross it, and that this kind of campaign is actually no different. We don't have a mechanism to force people to take strike action. We have to persuade them. And for academics like myself, it doesn't mean refusing to unload a ship in a port. It actually means saying no in the departmental meeting to the head of department's proposal for a new collaboration with Tel Aviv University, saying no in having an informal coffee and a chat with your colleagues who may be starting to incubate a new research proposal that would involve collaboration with either complicit companies or with Israeli institutions, saying no to that partnership that might benefit your research initiative, and the money that would come with it. As example, in Cambridge, a university where I'm from, one of the targets of student action recently, which got support of around 1,600 members of the university, was to say no to a partnership with BAE Systems, which is called the Cambridge Service Alliance, and also includes Caterpillar as another so-called industrial partner. It means having the courage to say no to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which Hisham spoke about. But as I said, it also means being able to say yes, so that, for example, to make sure that Palestinian colleagues are invited to speak, that Palestinian students or people working on the history of Palestine, the politics, the culture, society of Palestine, know that they will be defended against vexatious complaints or attempts to smear them as anti-Semites. That if UCU members, for example, face complaints either from outside bodies or from students or even from other members of staff, based on the faulty definitions of anti-Semitism that are put forward by the IHRA working definition, that they will be backed up by their union branch, that they will not go into those meetings and disciplinaries alone, that they will be supported, and that they will also be supported in a campaigning sense. And likewise, students who come under attack for expressing their views, whether in class or whether in terms of their political activism or in their journalism, we will speak out and show that we are on their side. I want to mention very briefly a couple of tools that I think are really important at the moment, one of which is actually organising, as colleagues here have been doing in KCL UCU, to bring forward motions to discuss at the local branch meeting to win over colleagues to supporting these positions. I spoke at UCU Congress, which happened recently, on a late motion that put forward a concrete proposal for reaffirming our commitment to BDS inside UCU as a decision by academics to examine the consequences of our potential complicity with an apartheid regime and to say no to that. But there are also other things that I want to interrupt. Sorry?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but if you could kindly come to closing remarks, please.
Yeah, I want to highlight an initiative that has just been recently relaunched by BRICUP, which is the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, which I'm a member of, which is called the Academic Commitment for Palestine. This was originally launched in 2015 and was signed by around 700 scholars in UK higher education institutions, and it's a personal, individual commitment not to collaborate with Israeli institutions and not to be involved in research projects with them, not to referee for journals based there, and so on. This has recently been relaunched in the last week or so, and I just wanted to highlight it here as the kind of tool that you can use to help build up a critical mass of support for these kinds of campaigns. So I've put that into the chat, and just really to say that I think this is we need to see more of this kind of meeting. We need to have meetings like this, not just in every university, but also, you know, in every school and department, so that we can win over that mass support for this campaign and go forward to help show that we will not allow our Palestinian comrades to continue being attacked. We will stand with them until victory.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Next up, we have José Nivoy. José is a shop steward for the USP, an Italian central union, and a spokesperson for the CALP, which is a dock workers collective in Livorno. They've organized previous actions in Genoa and the recent one in Livorno. They'll be joined by translators.
Ciao a tutti compagni, grazie per averci dato la possibilità di intervenire in un'importante riunione così di ampio respiro a livello internazionale. Tutto nasce nel 2019, quando abbiamo identificato queste navi della compagnia Bari che trasportavano armi verso i teatri di guerra come quello arabo-yemenita o turco-siriano. In quell'occasione organizzammo uno sciopero per bloccare i traffici di armi diretti in quei teatri di guerra dove vengono massacrate popolazioni civili. Fummo spinti, diciamo, da una questione etico e morale, perché non volevamo essere partecipi di quello che è l'ingranaggio e la filiera della produzione delle armi. Quindi organizzammo questo sciopero per bloccare questo carico di armi dirette, in quel caso nel porto di Jeddah, che è in Arabia Saudita. Diciamo che quando noi vediamo le scene delle bombe che esplodono nei teatri di guerra, no? Quindi dei video su YouTube piuttosto che nei telegiornali, quello lì è l'atto finale. Ok, quando noi vediamo le esplosioni di queste bombe o l'uso di queste armi nei teatri di guerra, è l'atto finale di una produzione. Tutto parte dall'Occidente, no? Quindi dall'Europa o comunque dagli Stati Uniti. Una produzione che parte dalle università, quindi poi passando per la progettazione nelle università, attraversando le fabbriche. Per esempio qua in Italia abbiamo l'RVR, che è una delle maggiori produttrici di missili usati nel contesto militare Arabia Saudita, arrivando fino alla logistica. Quindi in quel momento noi decidemmo di bloccare uno di questi ingranaggi, che era la logistica, quindi il momento finale, quasi finale della produzione delle armi, fino poi ad arrivare nei teatri di guerra. Quindi da quell'esperienza lì siamo arrivati a circa un mese fa che abbiamo costruito questa organizzazione, diciamo, questo coordinamento nazionale dei porti italiani, che ci ha permesso di entrare in relazione con altri portuali italiani e anche con altri portuali a livello europeo. Quindi questa cosa ci ha permesso di dialogare con altri portuali e nel caso specifico con il tentativo di blocco dei container diretti in Israele, abbiamo incominciato a comunicare con i portuali di Livorno, comunicandogli appunto che nel loro porto era in arrivo, in transito, questa nave, l'Asiatic Island, con dentro 3 container di missilistica appunto per l'esercito israeliano e da poi usare. A quel momento abbiamo visto che ha preso grande forza quel messaggio che abbiamo cercato di lanciare appunto con i portuali compagni di Oakland, no? Arrivando anche ai portuali francesi della CSD piuttosto che ai portuali del Sudafrica. Quindi da lì poi è nata l'idea di costruire questa giornata internazionale che pensiamo possa avvenire intorno a ottobre-novembre di quest'anno, lanciando diciamo, questa giornata internazionale contro il traffico delle armi nei porti. Quindi diciamo che da ora fino ad arrivare a ottobre lavoreremo per cercare di avere dei contatti, come dire, concreti nei vari porti che saranno interessati ovviamente nel cercare di bloccare, di mandare un forte segnale ai governi per dire che i lavoratori portuali non vogliono essere partecipi di quelli che sono i massacri a oggi, nelle guerre che oggi vediamo, che contano quasi 40 conflitti in tutto il mondo. Quindi avremo bisogno di tutti i contatti, compreso voi, anzi rilancio che se riuscite a darci una mano per costruire questa giornata, e se vogliamo magari in qualche maniera rimanere in contatto e girarci i vari contatti a livello internazionale dei portuali e incominciare a elaborare anche con riunioni quella giornata lì. Ciao!
All right, thank you so much. Sorry about the confusion at the start there, everyone. And our final speaker is a brief intervention from Martina from the King's SU, who is going to talk to us briefly about what she sees as the next steps to realize a campaign here at King's.
Hi everyone, I'm Martina. I'm one of the Liberation Network officers at KCL UCU, and thank you all for coming today for this very important discussion. I'm just going to briefly talk about KCL for Palestine's next steps. But let me start by telling you about what KCL for Palestine is, as many people have been confused about that. So KCL for Palestine is a collective of King's students and workers aiming to create a network of students, workers, student societies and unions to campaign for BDS at King's. And we will be launching a KCL UCU campaign to push for BDS at King's very soon. And as Leanne has mentioned earlier, King's is complicit in Israel's occupation and human rights violations, that it has invested more than £5 million in companies that fund Israeli occupation. So what union campaigns can do is challenge, influence and change university structures, policies and behaviors by uniting students to collectively campaign for the changes that we want to see. And as KCL UCU has around 37,000 student members, when united, we can actually have a strong and powerful collective voice that can hold the university accountable and push for the meaningful changes. But in order for our campaign to be approved and supported by the union, we will need 50 signatures from student members. So I would like to encourage every King's student who is in the audience today to support the campaign once it's out, and tell people you know to support it as well. So make sure to follow the KCL for Palestine account on social media pages in order to stay updated on and know when the campaign is out. I'll put the link to our Twitter and Instagram in the chat, and we will also send an email to the attendees when the campaign is live. But if you have opted out of receiving updates from KCL for Palestine when registering for today's event, you can write your email in the Google Doc link that I'll put in the chat as well. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you so much, Martina. We'll now move to to other speakers. You were all amazing. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of the event. So